Hello, and welcome to another episode of Mountainside Thoughts here on Heavenward Thinking. Today we're continuing on in Exodus chapter 22, starting in verse 16. So I'll read that passage and we'll get started. If a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price, and she shall be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he must still pay the bride price for virgins. Do not allow a sorceress to live. Anyone who has sexual relations with an animal is to be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord must be destroyed. Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you are foreigners in Egypt. Do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. If you do, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will be aroused, and I will kill you with a sword. Your wives will become widows, and your children fatherless. If you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not treat it like a business deal. Charge no interest. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it by sunset, because that cloak is the only covering your neighbor has. What else can they sleep in? When they cry out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. Do not blaspheme God or curse the ruler of your people. Do not hold back offerings from your granaries or your vats. You must give me the firstborn of your sons. Do the same with your cattle and your sheep. Let them stay with their mothers for 7 days, but give them to me on the 8th day. You are to be my holy people. So do not eat the meat of an animal torn by wild beasts. Throw it to the dogs. So, Mike, as we look at this section, it has a lot of different commands and a lot of different topics in this. But what do you see as the overarching theme in this section?
Yeah, I think overall God is giving an example of how we should treat other people, how we should treat Him, and how we should treat different situations that might come up in our everyday lives. I mean, a lot of these are very based in that time, but a lot of them can still have things to teach us now. I mean, you see at the in verse 16, like the importance of um, like if someone sleeps with a virgin who is not pledged to be married, like he has to marry her, like and pay the price for that because really, I mean, the whole two will become one flesh thing. It's that important.
Mm,
And when they make that, they'll make that connection and intimacy, and they'll be bonded basically. And I think, and God was like, okay, if he's gonna do that, then they need to be married. And this is not to say that it's an excuse to be able to, um, like sleep with somebody that you already are going to be that you know you're going to be married to before marriage, but that's a whole different topic. But I just wanted to clarify that that's not according to God's will. But sort of the thought that God put into it, about how important that is, or about, um, I mean, we see some other interesting things in here, like verse 19 dealing with relations with an animal. Obviously, God was like, that's not healthy for anybody, and so they need to be dealt with. And I mean, we still see, like the implications of that. I mean, today, like people are making all of this weird stuff up about different, about their, like their intimacy lives, and
mm,
making and really perverting what God has shown, to be a man and a woman, and changing it into all different kinds of things, and saying like, "Oh, it's okay because this is the way I am," when it's clearly anti-biblical, in the vision that God has had for marriage. And I think that as we go down the list, we see like, oh, these are all things that God has put in place to protect us. Like
mm,
even in verse 31, not eating the meat torn up by a wild animal, and but instead throwing it to the dogs. Like you never know what's going to be in that meat. Like that could be poison. Who
mm.
knows? Like he's just trying to protect us in that and keep us from being hurt further. And I think that's a lot of what we have seen in the past few chapters. Is it's all about God's compassion for us is by keeping us away from that unhealthy stuff, protecting us. And it may look like he's trying to limit what we're supposed to do and all that, but he's really just protecting us from more pain, more suffering, that we have in this life. And we already have enough pain and suffering in this life because of sin. So God's really doing his best to prevent us from having to go through more of that from our own choices.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a lot in this whole section that really shows us the heart of God and how He is trying to protect us, how He's trying to guide us on the right path. He's given us His very word here. We should take that to heart. We should meditate on it, memorize it, study it, and put it into practice, is really the key part. I think for me, the key part comes in verse 31. The first half of the verse, I think, really sums up for me what we've been talking about for several weeks here, and certainly in tonight's topic here. You are to be my holy people. I think the heart of God in this passage really is that the people he's talking to, the Israelites, just as he tells us in the New Testament to be holy because he is holy, Jesus wants us to be his holy people. God wanted the Israelites to be his holy people back in the Old Testament. He's called us to something different than the rest of the world. We're supposed to be unique. We're supposed to be a light shining for Jesus, just as the Israelites in here were supposed to be a light shining for God and pointing to the Lord. I think it's important for us then to realize we have to live differently because we have to be thinking different and be different. That's where we get the whole idea of heavenward thinking. We got to be thinking different and being different for Jesus. And that comes in all kinds of different ways. And we see that in this passage. There's lots of different things that we can do that honors God and honors other people that maybe is a little different than the world. I love how you mentioned the sexual relations and the intimacy and all those different things, because the world today wants to tell us that you can be whatever gender you want to be, you can have relations with whoever you want or whatever you want. Lately it's even getting into animals, and we're going way backwards and back in time, and we're seeing all kinds of crazy things that we might not have even thought of a couple decades ago. But we see people who are just twisting everything that God's created, just like the devil tries to do, and they're living their own lives the way they want to live, completely blind to what God wants them to do and the higher calling He has for each one of us. And so I think when we look at passages like this, we really get a glimpse of how we are supposed to be set apart, how we're supposed to treat people differently, how we're supposed to be different. And so I really think we get the heart of God in this passage, even though it might be a difficult passage to look at. If we're supposed to live differently, Mike, how can we really put this into practical terms in today's language?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a big key to really realizing how we can live nowadays. It's so difficult in this age of like, oh, you're free to be you and do what you want and make yourself happy and live to please yourself. And you're born a certain way and like all of that kind of stuff that's really just there to it's really just there to let people down, if I'm
Mm,
being honest. Like that's why we have so much anxiety, we have so much depression, we have so many mental health problems now, is because of that mentality, and people are turning away from God and focusing their attention on themselves and what they can do and what they want to do, and that just does never goes well. So I think in modern terms it's really just thinking, I mean, obviously it's studying the word and knowing the heart of God and the will of God, being able to identify like, oh, is this something that is like, when making a decision, is this something that is according to God's will? Would He be pleased with me if I did this? Is this part of being his holy people, or is this something that I would do that would displease God or hurt somebody else or along those lines? And I think it's really knowing scripture and knowing how God sees things, and being able to look at it from that higher perspective, that heavenward perspective of, is this helping myself or others have a better relationship with God, or is this tearing down someone or hurting myself or hurting um, or affecting negatively for the kingdom or something along those lines? I think it all needs to be looked at from that perspective. And I think practically, if we're looking at that, um, we need to look at the decisions that we make in our lives, and even as simple as like just talking to people, like, or is there a way in which you talk to somebody that can build them up, encourage them, be you can be someone that they're happy to be around, you can spread joy, and kind of shine before them in that way? Or are you somebody who's constantly tearing down others and causing problems and making drama? or and hurting your witness, so to speak, in front of others and making Christianity look unattractive to people. And I think that's really one of the main ways you can kind of think about it is, am I kind of shining before these people and making them curious about, like, oh, what's different about them? Or am I going before them and being and making people say, oh, I really don't want to be anything like them. You see what they do. So I think it's all about like protecting your witness and keeping yourself held accountable for your actions with according to the word and according what God would have you do.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, because this whole section, it really shows us how important it is for us to be good witnesses, to be pure, to be God's holy people, and to set ourselves apart for God. And it's very strict sounding in this passage. The language here, it seems very strict. It seems very severe for punishments on people. But I think it's because it's showing us the heart of God and showing us the seriousness of our sin. And I've said that many times as we've gone through these sections, because each section reminds us of God's heart, how much he loves us, much he's trying to give us a better way than the world, and how much he's trying to set us apart for him. But it also shows us the seriousness of sin and that God has to punish sin. I look at verses like verse 20, whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord must be destroyed. We look at that and we think that that is certainly true in that time period. Yeah, there were probably lots of people who were sacrificing to other gods. It was a common thing. There were idols. Just like we talked about back in the Ten Commandments. That was something that was back then, but we usually stop there, and we don't realize that that is just as relevant today as it was then. That there's just as many people today sacrificing to other quote-unquote gods as there were back then. We just have different names for them. They might not be a physical statue or some being we think that maybe lives inside a tree or something like that, but we have our own gods and our own idols when we put money or people or things or any hobbies we have or anything that we like to do in the front of God. That becomes just as much a god to us as an idol was back then. So we need to be careful, I think, in today's world that we don't just throw aside some of these old sayings and call them culturally relevant back then. We need to look at them and see that this is a serious thing. We need to make sure that our hearts are pure today, that we don't have anything else that's in the way of God, because we're never going to be able to do any of the rest of these things properly. We're never going to be able to measure up at all if our heart first isn't right with God. And that first thing is making sure that God is the center of our life, that he is the foundation of our life, that everything we do is flowing out of our love for God and our desire to serve him. And then we'll be able to successfully avoid these other traps that are in this section. So I think, as you pointed out, it all boils down to our witness in this section and our love for God and our call to be holy. And then we have to realize that there is a serious problem when we get off track. So we need to make sure that we are staying on track, seeking after the Lord, and trying to fulfill the calling that Jesus gave us in the New Testament to be holy, for I am holy. Now, we're never going to be able to do that perfectly because we're sinful human beings, but we're supposed to be every day becoming a little bit more and a little bit more each day like Jesus. So I would really encourage our viewers to consider that this week and to really consider your witness for Jesus. And then, as always, that you would join us next time for another episode of Mountainside Thoughts here on Heavenward Thinking.